report. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the First Nations people on whose traditional lands this is the Nangwal and the Nembre people on which we meet to pay our respect to the elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending today's event. Well, thank you again from Canberra for joining us. Just a run through of the event today. We will have Dr. Tess Newton-Cain, who's the lead of the Pacific Hub at Griffith Asia Institute, and also was the lead on the project. She will present the findings of the report. Then we will have Associate Professor Dr. Sandra Tarte, the head of school for School of Law and Social Sciences at the University of the South Pacific, who will provide discussant comments on the report and general sort of overview of the issue that we're discussing today. After that, we have question and answer session. Because this is a webinar, you will have to use the Q&A function in Zoom to pose your questions, and I will ask the questions to the panel. And after the Q&A, we will have closing remarks by Professor Chris, who's the Dean of Research of the Griffith Business School based in Brisbane. So I'll hand over to Tess for the report findings.
Bula, Vinaka Romitesh for that, and welcome everybody. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the some slides that will accompany what I have to say. So this is the full title of our research. It is available in hard copy as well. It's an examination of how Chinese engagement on climate change aligns with Pacific priorities. Before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional guardians and custodians of the land from which I join you here in Meanjin, also known as Brisbane. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, including those who are joining us today. So this is our research team. Some of them you've already met. So Melody Ruitt is a PhD student here with us here at Griffith University. Romitesh, who is chairing this event, thanks Romit, is also a PhD student. He's at ANU, and Professor Caitlin Byrne is the former director of the Griffith Asia Institute, now Pro-Vice Chancellor of the Business School here at Griffith, and this research was supported by some funding from the US Embassy in Suva, and obviously we thank them for that support. So the objectives of this research were three. There were three objectives. We wanted to locate China's engagement in the Pacific Islands climate change discourse for a couple of reasons. Well, essentially because we just felt it was something that hadn't really been addressed in any great detail elsewhere. What we're offering today, what we're launching today, we see very much as a conversation starter in that space. It's certainly not the definitive piece, but we hope that it prompts some thinking and some discussion in the region and elsewhere. We were very keen to explore Pacific perspectives about China's engagement with that discourse. So this is very much, the work that we did was very much to get a sense of how this engagement plays out for Pacific leaders, for Pacific academics, for regional officials, and also for civil society in the countries that we looked at. And obviously we also wanted to contribute to a broader scholarship on climate diplomacy, and this aligns with work that we've done previously at the Pacific Hub in connection with the Climate Action Beacon here at Griffith. So our target countries, some of which appear on that map, were Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and we also did some work around the Pacific regional position. Now, across those four countries, we've got a range of things happening. We've got a couple of three countries there, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, and Vanuatu, that have quite well established and quite mature relationships with China. And then we have Solomon Islands, which is a relatively new one. As we know, there was the switch to China in 2019. So different perspectives, different experiences of working with Chinese officials, Chinese contractors, securing Chinese investment or development assistance. So, we had a range of different perspectives to draw on. These are the lines of inquiry that we use to formulate the research questions. So, the alignment of China's engagement in the region with their positions elsewhere, whether that's domestically or on the global stage. What does climate engagement by China look like in a bilateral sense? So that's country to country. What does that engagement look like in a regional sense? And to what extent do we see that changing? What are the Pacific perceptions of China's climate engagements? And again, we looked at those from a range of perspectives, and given, something I'll touch on later, we do have quite a strong, there's quite a strong thread of civil society perspectives on that. How, if at all, does China's climate engagement influence how it's seen as a diplomatic or development partner in the Pacific? So how does this fit within the wider sense of how China engages in the region and how that's perceived? And I think one of the things that struck me, that one of the most significant things that I was told when we were doing this research, I think from one of the people I spoke to in Vanuatu, was they said, we don't think about this. We don't think about China. We don't think about climate change when we think about China. We don't think about China when we think about climate change. It's not part of how we talk about our engagement with China, and maybe it should be. So certainly if this little piece of work helps contribute to that sort of growing that sort of debate, then I think we'd be very, very happy about that. So the methodology was not particularly exciting. It was fairly sort of standard. Obviously, we did a desktop study that included looking at some literature. There's a lot of literature about China's engagement in the Pacific, or there's a growing amount of it. Very little of it focuses specifically on this issue of climate change. We also did a media scan so that we could have a look at speeches, statements by leaders, statements by Chinese officials, and then we supplemented what we found there with some key person interviews. And as I've already touched on, we talked to people from the media, from civil society, we talked to academics and regional bureaucrats. Given that this research was done during the COVID era, we did conduct those interviews remotely using Zoom or Teams. That was quite a new experience for me. Normally, when I do research in the Pacific, I am, very keen to be out there in the coffee shops and the kava bars of the various capitals around the place. So that wasn't possible. So we did do them remotely, and we were able to conduct 14 interviews. They lasted between about 45 and 60 minutes. So there was an opportunity to kind of, pursue a couple of things with people, get them to sort of maybe go a bit deeper than they initially thought. It was interesting that a number of people said to us, well, I don't know that there's much to say. And then when we actually started talking, we discovered that there was quite a bit to say. So hopefully we've been able to capture some of the key aspects of that. So the participation rates, we've got this here, and it was quite significant. So we identified 52 people that were across those various countries and in the regional space that we thought we could benefit from talking to. And of that, we made contact with 37 of them. But we only managed to get 14 interviews. Now, Romitesh and I were the ones that did the interviews. We are both very, Romitesh and I have worked together, we've worked separately in all of these countries and at the regional level. And we have extensive contacts, and we have personal relationships, and favors traded to draw on. We struggled to get a better response rate than that. And there were a few factors there. One was the fact that we were doing it remotely rather than in person. I think that was, welcomed by some and not by others. We did have some people that just didn't respond. And we also had a couple of people that said that they felt it was too sensitive to talk about. Now, we didn't explore that. That wasn't an area of inquiry from us, but we're just going to put that as there, that it was noted that for some people, particularly national policymakers, were quite cautious, either didn't respond or just said no, they didn't want to talk to us. So that, I think that's something that we need to note as a point of interest, and obviously something that we're going to need to have to think about if we want to do more research of this type. So the second key finding that I want to highlight for you is how this looks at the regional level. And I think this quote here is a really good example of how these regional conversations take place. And this research was done and documented before the adoption of the Blue Pacific Strategy, although that was already very much in contemplation. But we're only going to see that more. As you can see, there's a reference here to the Boy Declaration. Climate change is the thread in pretty much all of the conversations when it comes to these regional conversations. So the idea that at a regional level, whether you're talking with SPC or SPREP or there's Forum Secretariat, that you wouldn't be talking about climate change. And that could be mitigation, it could be climate finance, it could be disaster response, it could be any of those things. This is going to be a central part of the conversation. So at the regional level, people said to us, yes, we have conversations with China as a development partner, and yes, we talk to them about climate change. And the perceptions of the quality or the quantum of those conversations varied a bit. Generally, there was a sense of it's not a big conversation, because up until quite recently, China's engagement at the regional level has been quite limited. That may be changing. So it's not a big conversation, but it's a significant conversation. And certainly at the regional level, there is appetite and scope for that conversation to be expanded. And again, depending on how things go, that may be part of what we'll see going forward. Once we start looking at the bilateral position, conversations between national policymakers and Chinese interlocutors who may be diplomats, often, and this kind of draws on the work of people like Graham Smith and Deng Zhang, that often the conversations are with Chinese contractors. As we know, they are very present in the region, and they're often leading and brokering the deals around big infrastructure projects. So what we found there was that if this topic was going to get on the table, if climate change was going to become a focus for discussion, it was beholden on the Pacific interlocutors to bring that to the table. That wasn't something that the Chinese side would say, well, why don't we talk about this? That was something that the Pacific side needed to bring. Generally, we heard a mixed range of views, but certainly we did hear that there was a perception that if that issue is brought to the table and, that the Chinese side is asked about that there was the ability and the appetite for China to be responsive. And I use the term responsive rather than reactive. So again, it's really about when Pacific interlocutors articulate their priorities, there is scope and there is the flexibility and like I say, the appetite for China to respond to that and to seek to align what it's doing with those priorities as articulated. But it's, again, the start of that conversation needs to come from the Pacific side. And this is this is the first area of disconnected discourse. We've got the regional position where it's a very integrated, interwoven conversation. once we get to the bilateral position, things start to get a bit more segmented. And so what we heard was a sense of, oh, well, no, we talked to China about economic development and infrastructure. And we talked to other people, the European Union, the USA, Australia, whoever, about climate change. But where we do talk to China about climate change, there seems to be some scope for that. So there's a further disconnect at the national level, and that's between how climate change is perceived by communities and civil society and what happens in the rooms between national policymakers and their Chinese counterparts, such as the contractors. And what we saw there, and I think this quote illustrates that, is that at the civil society community level, there's a very strong sense of the importance of climate change, of the urgency of addressing climate change issues and climate change impacts, whether that's responding to disasters or the more sort of longer onset issues, such as having to relocate villages because of coastal erosion. So at the community and civil society level, that is very present. That is very much a part of their thinking and their discourse. What they see on the part of their leaders, the policymakers, the ones that are signing these deals. And remember that, as we know, quite often this might be an individual politician, it might be a minister. It's not necessarily even senior bureaucrats that are involved. It's very much a political process. What they see is their leaders taking steps, making decisions, doing deals that don't prioritize climate change and possibly don't even reference it at all. So there's a sense that the people that are making these decisions, that are bringing in these investments and these projects, possibly don't understand the science or the urgency of the situation. So this is another area of disconnect. And I think that one of the things that I hope the data that we've put forward and the analysis that we've done will indicate, particularly as the Pacific becomes more present on lots of people's radar, I think one of the things that it really does indicate is just the importance of appreciating and trying to understand the nuance of how these debates go in the region. So, we often hear, well, you have to talk to the Pacific about climate. Well, what this piece of work shows, which we already know, or some of us already know, is that there's no one conversation with the Pacific about anything. And there's certainly no one conversation with the Pacific about climate and climate change. That conversation needs to be nuanced and reformulated depending on who you're talking to, where you're talking, and what the context is in which that conversation takes place. So again, civil society engagement is really important. As we know, in the Pacific, a lot of the push for climate change activism and indeed a lot of the climate change diplomacy is driven from within civil society. And whilst we are seeing political actors involved, they're sometimes a bit late to the party. Often a lot of hard work's been done before they come on board. And I think I've touched on this previously, generally at the civil society level, where they might be looking for funding for some advocacy work or support for projects that they're doing in communities with learning about resilience or learning about disaster preparedness, or, all of these things that civil society groups are involved in. Their response, or part of what we heard from them, was, well, we don't think of going to China for support for this type of work. We might go to the UK or France or Australia, but it's not something that they see China as being supportive of. Now, based on what we know about how China engages in other areas, there's no reason to think that if civil society groups were to approach China, that they wouldn't be well received. There's no reason to think that there wouldn't be the opportunity to support them, but we've yet to see that happening. And what's not in the report, but what has occurred to me since, is part of that maybe, and I don't know, but one of the aspects of Chinese engagement that we've yet to really see in the Pacific is the use of, or the engagement of, Chinese NGOs. Now that may not come. If it does come, it might be interesting to see how that works, to what extent Chinese NGOs might partner with Pacific NGOs around issues to do with climate change. So this is kind of a bit of a narrative framework or schema that you'll see reflected in the report. And it was kind of a way of helping us sort of organize our thinking and organize how we might structure these conversations. What does the engagement look like in relation to mitigation? What does it look like in relation to adaptation and climate finance? And what does it look like in relation to disaster readiness and response? And we receive, there's a range of responses to this. The mitigation one is an interesting one. There's certainly a recognition in the region that China is a large emitter of CO2 and other gases. And there's a recognition of the need for China to do better on that. There is an awareness of the most recent commitment by China to be carbon neutral by 2060. There's a range of responses to that. So, that position in terms of what China's doing to mitigate its own emissions is definitely present in the thinking of Pacific people that are thinking about this all the time. In terms of adaptation and climate finance, so the projects, so if we put this within the context of infrastructure projects, which are very prevalent in the region, the infrastructure commitments, the investments and the deals and the agreements and the projects are very much focused around economic development rather than climate change adaptation. So people, and this, I think this speaks to a really the political economy context in which these conversations take place. Politicians are being told by their constituents, particularly in rural areas, that they need a road so that the women can be driven to the clinic to deliver their babies as opposed to having to walk, or so that the kids can get to school in an hour rather than 4 hours. They need a bridge so that the kids don't have to get on a leaky boat to go across the river to go to school. They need a wharf so that they can get product from where it's grown to where it can be sold. These are the sorts of projects, these are the sorts of signals and tokens or demonstrations of development that people are looking for. And we're kind of now in a position where, because largely through the impact of China, but other donors as well, because these infrastructure developments are appearing, not just in capital cities, but elsewhere, and because of the increased movement of information, communities are increasingly saying, well, we know that these people on this island have a road, so we'd like one as well. And so this is driving a lot of this discussion. So that's what's driving these conversations about infrastructure projects, more so than adapting to climate change. Now that may change, but at the moment, that's kind of how it's been for quite a while, and it's where it still currently is. In terms of climate finance, China, at the regional level, China has provided some funding for the technical work and the scoping of the Pacific Resilience Fund. And certainly there is a hope that if and when that fund becomes fully established, that China would be a significant contributor to the capitalization of that fund. When it comes to disaster readiness and response, this is an area where China is not perceived as being particularly engaged. The response aspect is quite interesting. China certainly does respond in the scope when disasters strike, whether it's cyclones or flooding or other things. It wasn't noted particularly strongly by our participants, I should say. I guess that, and this is where, the kind of the optics of disaster response and the modalities really play out in terms of what stays in people's memories. So, New Zealand or Australia sending a ship or, helicopters from France or wherever. These obviously they're very big impact events when things like that happen, and they obviously resonate very strongly and they stay in people's memories. China's response to disasters has up until quite recently been a bit lower key, and up until the Tonga situation that we had earlier this year hadn't involved military assets, but that may change going forward. That's something that we'll be keeping an eye on. So one of the things that we did when we spoke with people is we road tested this sense of, is China a climate ally for the Pacific? Is that term climate ally something that people would comfortably associate with China? And I think that, we kind of got a range of views on this. I think that first quote is quite interesting, and particularly in terms of how we saw the Pacific's responses to Australia, to a lesser extent New Zealand, up until quite recently, is this sense of, a lot of it is about having an other, and it's about portraying China as better as a way of, trying to nudge or shame other people into doing better or doing more, particularly when it comes to emissions commitments. So other people, the overall tendency in response to this was that there was definitely scope and appetite to see China as an ally in the future. So there was definitely opportunity to involve China to be a champion of the Pacific's position on climate change. There was we heard a number of references to the sense that China was a location of technical and scientific know-how, that they could offer a lot to the Pacific in terms of making more and better use of renewable energy, and that there was a particular opportunity for Pacific students to study in China and to study quite sort of what I usually call sort of hard subjects like engineering, geothermal stuff, electrical, energy related subjects. So turning out scientists, engineers, technicians who would be able to bring those skills back to their countries and take forward new technologies and new methodologies that would be much more climate friendly than maybe they'd had previously. So in terms of what we think might come next or future considerations and questions. So one of the things that we looked at was whether there was an opportunity for greater collaboration and cooperation with China on the part of the USA or other development partners. Now, one of the reasons that I picked this area of research was I thought it would be quite nice and quiet and we could just like potter away in the background and there wouldn't be lots happening. Of course, that changed completely. I think one of the things that we've seen is that there is an increasing intersection between the geostrategic anxiety that we know is playing out and that is having a big impact in the Pacific, and the ongoing issue of the climate emergency and how that is impacting the Pacific. And so even since, this report was written, we've seen a breakdown in that, US-China commitments, aspiration to work together to address the impacts of climate change and to address the climate emergency. That had only been recently restated in the lead up to COP26. So that kind of gives you an indication of how quickly these things can move and just how increasingly interconnected all of these discussions are becoming. But so that's kind of the bad news. On the good news side, I think it is noteworthy that when Minister Wang Yi did his tour of the Pacific, and in the position paper that has now been put forward for consideration by Pacific Island countries, the ones that have relationships with China, one of the things that was mentioned frequently and does appear in that position paper, I think it's point 14, is this assertion or putting forward by China of its ostensible willingness and interest in trilateral cooperation in the Pacific. So, that door remains possibly half open. I think, given that the climate emergency is so critical for the Pacific, it is the existential threat. It is central to things like the Boe Declaration and the Blue Pacific Strategy. There will certainly be a push at the regional level, I would guess, for partners to, work together to walk the talk of we're here to support the Pacific. At the national level, that may not be as prevalent and that may vary from place to place. But certainly if you look at things like the Paris Principles and the Cairns Compact and calls that we've heard from Pacific policymakers for a very long time, generally working together is considered better than not. It minimizes transaction costs and it puts less strain on national systems. So I think that is something that we might be coming back to think about again. We also think that the scope for looking at how Chinese narratives or norms develop in response to the implementation of the Blue Pacific Strategy. We've seen Chinese narratives adopt that terminology with increasing frequency, as have other partners. Excuse me. So we'll be interested to see how that develops and becomes more sophisticated as the Blue Pacific Strategy becomes fully socialized, as it acquires an implementation plan and becomes a much stronger driving force of regional activity. Recently, there were a number of cooperative centers that were announced. This was in 2021. One of them was the China Pacific Islands Climate Change Cooperation Center. It's a very long name. It's got lots of C's in it. This has now been established and it's been opened. I had thought that it might be located in Samoa. It hasn't been located in Samoa. It is located in China. I think, it'll be interesting to see how that goes, what it means in terms of what functions it takes on, how those align with Pacific priorities, and I guess very importantly, what opportunities that creates for developing and supporting Pacific expertise. So, how many Pacific Island people will be working within this center or leading on projects that this center might do. As we know, there's a long way to go between saying we're going to have a center or even opening it and it actually becoming something that has a presence and that is contributing to the overall environment. And then another aspect, and I did touch on this briefly, is about military aspects of addressing challenges associated with climate change, including in relation to HADAR. As I said, in Tonga, we did see the PLAN deployed, which from as far as I'm aware, and obviously I'm happy to be corrected, is the first time that has happened in disaster response in the Pacific. This may be something that China wants to do more of. I'm not going to mention a base, but it does raise issues of pre-positioning, how different groups work together, military to military, military to civil. So I think adding in that, would make what is all. I mean, if we look at what happened in Tonga, and this isn't a part of this research, there was a lot of hardware off, sitting off Nuku'alofa for quite some time. And, that raises all sorts of issues about interoperability, communications, and again, making sure that what is being brought to bear is not overwhelming national systems and national priorities. So thank you to the members of the research team, all of whom contributed in various ways to make this a really enjoyable experience. Thank you particularly to the participants who gave very generously of their time and their thinking. Certainly the ones I spoke to were very thoughtful and about the issues and really contributed an awful lot to my understanding of this region. Thank you to our very excellent advisory group, of which Sandra and Chris were part. And thank you to you for being part of this launch event. And with that, I think I will hand back to you, Romit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tess, for presenting the results. I'll just now hand over to Dr. Sandra Tarte for some discussion comments. Over to you, Dr.
Tarte. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Romit, and thank you, Tess and colleagues, for the invitation to be part of today's launch. As mentioned, I was part of a small reflection group, advisory group, that gave some feedback to the research team at various stages of the project. So I have followed this work with much interest. And I want to make the observation at the outset that it was no easy task carrying out this research in the midst of a pandemic, especially reaching out to officials and other informants in the region. And I congratulate the research team for their achievement. I think with this report, some important steps have been made in researching a very crucial aspect of the Pacific's relations with China. How Chinese engagement on climate change aligns with Pacific priorities is an area that is little understood and has not been given the attention it deserves. And it is one, I think, that will hopefully be prioritized in the future. I say this for a number of reasons. As mentioned by Tess, China is the world's largest carbon emission emitter. This is noted in the report. How ambitious China is in its commitments to reduce its emissions is of crucial importance to the Pacific and to the world. Being able to coordinate and work with China at the global level, at COP conferences, for example, is recognized as a key diplomatic priority for the region, by some Pacific leaders at least. Therefore, understanding where the Pacific can find points of influence and synergies with China on climate diplomacy is something that requires further study. At the regional level, while China is obviously a major development partner for many Pacific Island states, it is not seen as a major source of climate financing. This has obviously come out through the research. But that can change. And as this report outlines, in part, it's a question of the Pacific governments prioritizing this in their relations and dialogues with China. I just want to touch on one aspect of climate assistance to the region, and that is the humanitarian and disaster response. Tess has commented on this. There is clearly a gap here in China's aid policy. And an interesting observation that's made is that, and one reason for this lack of visibility of China in the field of HADR is that the Chinese military has not until recently been a part of this work, unlike that of our traditional development and security partners. But is there an opportunity here for the Pacific to encourage greater coordination and collaboration between China and traditional partners in responding to disasters in the region? One of the misconceptions, if not dangers, in the current discourses around the Pacific's changing geopolitics is the idea that the island states somehow have to take sides to choose between China and the West. Wadanasi recently labeled that the false Pacific dilemma. He was referring to economic partnerships. But when it comes to the fight against climate change, everyone arguably is on the same side. The report ends with, or at the end of this report, there is an important point made that despite the tensions between the US and China, addressing climate change is an area that they can and need to cooperate on. With a strong Pacific-led focus and strategy, our region can provide the location, perhaps, for such a partnership. Just to conclude my remarks, this report shows that China has not been considered or thought of much by Pacific actors as a climate ally. While more interviews on the ground may reveal a broader range of views, what this report turns a spotlight on is the potential that exists for China to become that ally, despite the challenges and hurdles. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sandra, for your comments. Just to let the participants know, you can ask your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom. There are two comments, one question and a comment from Professor Elizabeth Holland from USP. I think the question is there scope for the Pacific to talk to China about climate change action, climate resilience, resilient infrastructure, and action by China to reduce emissions, following the model of dialogue with Australia? And I think the statement, the comment is that I think Professor Elizabeth Holland is contextualizing her question by saying that she recognizes that the effectiveness of Chinese moratorium on coal-fired power plants that was in place before the Paris Agreement was possibly one of the important factors of slowing CO2 emissions and giving us 3 years of flat emissions in a row. So thank you for that, Professor Holland. I'll hand it over to Tess if she wants to respond.
Thank you, Romit, and thank you, Professor Holland, for that question and comment. So I think there are a couple of aspects to this. One is that certainly one person said to me that they felt that the overall feeling towards China was that we had taken a hit at COP26, and this was as a result of the late intervention by a group, comprising China, India, and possibly others, to water down the text about phasing out of coal. So that was considered. That was seen as very disappointing for the Pacific negotiators. They were very disappointed to see that. Elsewhere, people said to me that, certainly one person said to me quite bluntly that if China says it's going to be carbon neutral by 2060, then we can believe that. It's an honest country and we believe that that's be the case. I think in terms of the Pacific talking to China, where this can get a bit tricky actually comes down to the makeup of the Pacific regional organizations. So, for example, if you look at the Pacific Islands Forum, which is where you might expect this kind of conversation to take place, Australia was a member and China isn't. So that gave the Pacific a lot more leverage in terms of the dialogue with Australia, because it's like, well, you're in the club, you're supposed to be on the team. China doesn't fulfill that role. But I think possibly more significantly than that is the fact that within the makeup of the Pacific Islands Forum, you have some countries that don't have established recognized relationships with China as diplomatic partners. They may have trade relationships, but they don't have diplomatic relationships. And we've seen previously that attempting to get a regional position on China, and I guess the aspect that I'm thinking of is about debt. So when Tonga tried to push for the Pacific Islands Forum to put forward a joint position on asking China to forgive debt, that was scuppered very quickly. The other members were very gun shy of all, trying to put together this consolidated position. And I think that gun shyness remains. It may not be as strong. I think what we've seen recently with the attempt to get this sort of pan-Pacific regional security and economic agreement, I think has made people, maybe take half a step back and think, okay, we need to be a bit more canny about this. But I think there is still a sense that it's not yet possible for the Pacific to speak with one voice when it comes to engaging with China about anything. If they were going to do it, I think this is what it would be most likely to be about, because it's such an important situation, such an important issue. I think that from the flip side, as we know, there has been a push from China that the Pacific Islands Forum make some sort of statement or assertion of their acceptance of the One China principle. That has been pushed back on by the forum, understandably, again, because of the membership issue. I think China will continue to push for that. And, if, you might, this is very much in the realms of the hypothetical, but I could see that it could become, if the Pacific were to try and push for put forward that one position or a consolidated position, it could then be that would be the quid pro quo, that China would say, well, if we're going to join you on this, you have to join us on this other thing. So, I think increasingly it's just impossible to kind of separate out even these really important conversations and say, look, we need to do this without worrying about the geopolitics. And, some of these players, these big geopolitical actors, are too far down that road. They're not in a position to pull back at this stage. So I hope, Sandra, did you want to add to that? I feel like I should be listening to you, not myself.
No, I think you've covered it well, Tess. Yeah, I mean, it is hard. It's a hard one with Taiwan. Just looking at the countries you did your research in. These are all China allies, right? Papua New Guinea, Solomons, Samoa, and Vanuatu. Yeah. So it'd be interesting to do this research in countries which are Taiwan allies, to see how they perceive it.
Yeah, I think there's another question that links to the Republic of China, Taiwan, and how are they engaging on climate change in the region? And is there a sense of competition with China in that space? So that's an anonymous question from one of the participants.
Yeah, well, as Sandra's just highlighted, we didn't talk to the countries that are aligned with Taiwan. Is there a competition in this space? It's hard to know. I'm just trying to, you say, I don't know enough about where Taiwan sits on the range of emissions, what their NDC is. Obviously, they provide significant amounts of aid to the countries with which they're aligned. They tend to focus around education, agriculture, and health. Now, all of those have climate change aspects to them. I know certainly they work in Marshall Islands around different aspects of composting and mulching to support farmers with working in areas that often have very little water because there's often droughts up there. So, they're certainly capable of working in that very technical way of adapting to the issues that people are dealing with. In terms of education, again, the offerings that that their students do, a range of things. They tend to sort of cluster into medicine. They train a number of doctors from those countries, and also people that work in like international business and trade and that sort of thing. Certainly, what we heard was that there was appetite for students from countries in the Pacific to learn things like geoscience, engineering, become technicians that can develop and, work with new technologies, new energy things. And, I'm sure that if those opportunities were to be offered by Taiwan to the countries they're aligned with, then they would be very well received, just as if they were to be offered by Australia or New Zealand or anybody else. These opportunities are going to be welcomed wherever they come from. But certainly that sort of, and also weather surveillance and predictions and modeling, that was something that a number of people said that they saw China would be able to offer their students.
Thank you, Tess. If there's any other questions, please, we've got a few more minutes. Dr. Tess, I just wanted to, there's one more question before I ask mine. So Kim Andreas Kessler from University of Otago, USP, is talking about what do we know about the views of Chinese communities living in Pacific Island countries, such as Fiji, Solomons, on the role of the Chinese government in the context of climate change in the region. And
well, let me just answer that briefly. That was, that was not something that we looked at in this particular piece of research. I think, as I said, this is very much a conversation starter. It was a very small piece of research. I think if research of this type was to go forward, I think that would be a really interesting line of inquiry to pursue. And I think that, again, we might see a different range of opinions. As we know, when we talk about Chinese communities in Pacific countries, there's a great variation. There are some families that have been there for generations and, are citizens and, have established family connections. And then there are others who are newer arrivals. It's some very new arrivals. So there's, I would expect there to be a something of a variation across that scope. But yeah, certainly, one to put on the to-do next list. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a comment and a question from Jeff Edwards. He's an adjunct with the School of Governance and Public Policy and also a scientist. And he is a founding vice president of a scholarly Norfolk Island Institute, and he lives in Norfolk Island. So his question is that traditional Norfolk Islanders do not regard the island as part of Australia, but their foreign policy is closely tied to that of Australia and Britain, and not so much so integrated within sort of the Pacific regionalism. Does the study team have any recommendations on the role that a new modest offshore scholarly institute might play in climate and strategic preparedness?
Right, thank you, Jeff. So Norfolk Island is very much a gap in my knowledge. I'm keen to learn more about what happens in Norfolk Island. I think, but based on what we know about these sorts of things in the rest of the Pacific, I think it's really important to establish, a very grounded context, whatever you want to talk about, whether it's climate change, trade, or education, is very much a sense of what we know is actually going on here. What are the issues that we're dealing with? How do they play out? And how does that affect different people? How does that affect our young people? How does it affect our business community? So I think in terms of, a scholarly inquiry or a scholarly endeavor, it's about really making sure that the data that you collect and present is robust, and its robustness comes from the fact that it is a nuanced representation of the whole of your community. It's an important contribution that your community has to make. Thanks.
Thanks. There's two questions, one by Annabelle. She's asking about the implications of the Solomon Islands political unrest. I think one of the things is that when we're asking for interviews was also at the sort of just prior to and during and after the Solomon Islands unrest as well, which I think had an impact on people not wanting to participate. And then Dr. Wesley Morgan, he's asking a question that Australia is saying that it wants to co-host COP29 with Pacific Island nations, and the US will no doubt make much of it. Its new climate legislation when Biden hosts Pacific Island leaders next month. Australia and the US seen as climate allies in the region. What would Australia need to do to be seen as a climate ally, and would this strengthen Australia's relations in the region?
Good morning, Wes. This isn't about Australia. This is a different thing. We didn't ask people to compare and contrast. You know, do you feel better about this one or worse about that one? Other countries did get mentioned, the US and Australia among them. I think does the Pacific, well, we didn't ask them. We didn't ask them, do you think the US is a climate ally? Do you think Australia is a climate ally? We only asked them about China. So the short and legitimate answer to that is, I don't know. I think based on what we've seen elsewhere, we do know that the Pacific Islands leadership, particularly at the regional level, has strong views about the roles of other partners. We know that there were concerns about the US withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, and there was general welcoming of their return to the Paris Agreement. We know that there was concern about the previous Australian government's position on climate change, and that the new Australian government's position has been welcomed with some caveats around this is a good start, but we want to see more. I think in terms of a co-hosting of a COP with the Pacific, I think that, you know, that seems to have been welcomed. It was, you know, it was referenced fairly warmly at the PIF leaders meeting. I think there is a sense, and Sandra, I'd be keen to get your thoughts on this. You sit much closer to this than I do. I think there is a bit of a sense of, well, let's wait and see. Are the Pacific, you know, is the Pacific, are Pacific leaders and Pacific academics and Pacific scientists, are they going to be integral to how this is designed and grown? Or are they just going to be like sort of brought in at the last minute and scattered around and, you know, sort of used not used, but sort of not necessarily given as much input into the co-creation. So I think it kind of depends, A, whether Australia gets that up at COP, and then B, how they go about using it to build relationships. I think it would be a great opportunity for Australia to build some really important and strengthen some really important relationships. Whether there is the scope, the appetite to make best use of that opportunity, I think remains to be seen. But I'm very keen to hear what Sandra's thoughts are on that.
Thanks, Tess. I'm actually looking for it in the communique there. It did make the communique. I'm just trying to find the wording for this. But I agree, this is something that has to be really carefully managed, not just imposed as an Australian push on the region, but something that is, if it's going to be a regional COP as such, then it needs to be done with the region fully involved in the sense shaping that agenda, and not just something that is made to look like a regional COP, but or whatever you call it, but is actually an Australian one. But I'm not sure. I think that at the moment there's probably, like you said, still wait and see and mixed views about this and what it means. Yeah, my concern, a little bit, just going back to some of the other questions, is that we have a regional framework for climate change diplomacy and various other aspects to this. We have the Pacific strategy that's just been adopted. What concerns me a little bit is a sort of great power regional strategy that's being imposed from outside. I mean, different kinds of regional groupings and frameworks that are being imposed from outside to, in a sense, I don't know how this will work, but just to perhaps push back a little bit on what the Pacific's agenda will be. So that's my concern. We talk about the regional architecture, and particularly how the climate change issue is going to be driven here by the Pacific. How much will that be, in a sense, taken over by outside, regionalisms that are being formed at the moment? That's my initial response.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Sandra.
Are there any last questions before we end the Q&A session of the launch? Tess, if you'd like to talk about the report and where it's sort of available, if it's available online.
Yes, I'm going to ask one of my Griffith Asia Institute colleagues who are hovering in the background to put the link to the report in the chat. It is available online. Melody, one of our team members, has written a blog that's gone out today, a blog post that summarizes some of the key findings. I also have boxes full of it in hard copy. So if you feel you need it in hard copy, please let me know and I will get a couple of them off to you in the post. Yeah, so we are very excited about it. It has been a bit of a, it was a bit of a process. I'd kind of forgotten about the impact of the Solomon Islands stuff on Romit, who was desperately trying to get people in Solomon Islands to talk to him. Well, actually, no, we just stopped. It was like, I think they've got more important things to worry about. So, we did have various bumps in the road along the way, but I think we're all fairly happy with where we've got to. Certainly I'm more than happy to receive any sort of feedback, good, bad, ugly, indifferent, once you've had a chance to read it. So please do feel free to drop me a line or, ping me on Twitter or something and let me know your thoughts and where you, where you think we went wrong or what you like about it.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Tess, for presenting the findings, and Dr. Sandra Tarte for agreeing to be a discussant. And to all the participants who listened in and asked questions. We're towards the end of the launch of the report. So I'll hand over to Professor Chris Fleming, who's the Dean of Research for Griffith Business School, for his closing remarks.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning. It was really good to see so many people engaged and talk about this, clearly timely piece of work. So, look, I'd like to begin by congratulating the authors on the piece of work and thanking them for inviting me to be a member of the advisory committee, as well as inviting me to have some closing remarks today. As I said, a timely piece of work. Both in terms of the geopolitical landscape and the obvious rising tension that we see in the region, but also in terms of the increasingly evident sort of physical realities of a changing climate. So I guess in terms of the report, a couple of things stood out for me. One was the diversity of engagement across the region with China on the issue of climate. And therefore, it's not a homogenous story. We need to be very careful when we try to draw generalized conclusions or observations. And in particular, it's important to avoid trying to make generalized recommendations. In saying that, I'm about to do some of that, but within the caveat of be careful. It's not a homogenous story at all. I think the other interesting thing for me out of this report was the fact that the onus seems to be on the Pacific to raise the issue of climate change with China, and that it's unlikely China will raise the issue unless it's prompted to do so. And I actually see that as a bit of an opportunity because it does give the Pacific the ability to steer the conversation, right? So that the conversation around climate addresses the Pacific needs and concerns rather than that of China. Related to that, the opportunities for the Pacific, I think, are at least twofold, or there's at least a couple that emerge. One is sort of the obvious one in terms of using the relationship with China to amplify the Pacific's voice when it comes to mitigation and urging the global community to reduce emissions and move towards net zero. But second, and something that I guess didn't get a lot of focus in this morning's conversation, so I'm going to steer us a little bit there as sort of a leading piece in that adaptation space. Because I think irrespective of any success on the mitigation front, the climate is changing and will continue to change. And China's engagement with the Pacific, again, making a generalization after saying I shouldn't, But to date, it's been broadly focused on infrastructure. And I would say it's critical that adaptation to climate change and climate resilience is built into project planning and execution when it comes to these infrastructure projects. And Tess commented earlier that the projects funded and often built by the Chinese have an economic development focus, not an adaptation focus. And I would argue that the two shouldn't and don't have to be mutually exclusive, and that adaptation is good economics. And then that infrastructure project should be welfare enhancing beyond narrow economic considerations. They should be assessed on health, social, economic governance, environmental and cultural grounds, and climate resilience should be baked into all of those components of that assessment. On that note, I would like to just add one further consideration sort of to leave you with to the list that Tess presented. And that's around addressing a knowledge gap. While there are lots of examples of maladaptive infrastructure projects, so projects that increase rather than decrease vulnerability to climate change, we simply don't have good understanding of what makes a project successful, both in terms of delivering welfare enhancing infrastructure and in adapting to climate change. And I see that as a really key piece of work going forward, a piece of work that asks, how do we ensure that infrastructure projects are designed to enhance welfare and improve resilience and adaptation. Given the earlier observation that China is unlikely to raise the climate issue unless prompted, it does feel the onus on steering that conversation around infrastructure projects towards adaptation and resilience falls onto the Pacific, and hopefully in collaboration with Australian-based researchers such as those based at Griffith and in the Griffith Asia Institute, really reframing the way we all parties think about investment in infrastructure. And let's be clear, this is not an issue that's unique to the Pacific nor to the Chinese-Pacific relationship. It's a global issue, but given the Pacific's vulnerability to a changing climate and the dominant role China can play in funding and delivering infrastructure, I think there's a role in this community in terms of leadership in that space. So I've taken you in a slightly different direction, in a direction that is probably close to my heart in terms of my background. For those of you who don't know me, is environmental economics and the evaluation of climate adaptation projects. And I think there's a really important role we can play here in making sure that when we do have investment from anywhere, but it seems China is going to be a major source of investment, we make sure that investment enhances the welfare of the Pacific people, but does in a way that really does help the region adapt and become more resilient to a changing climate. Because I think irrespective of what we can do in the mitigation space, which is clearly really important, irrespective of what we do in that space, the climate is changing and will continue to change for the foreseeable future. But again, congratulations everybody, all the authors on this report. Thank you to my colleagues on the advisory board. Great piece of work and much more to do from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chris. So on behalf of the research team led by Dr. Tess, Professor Caitlin, Melody, and I, thank you very much for coming and listening into the launch and for your participation. Thank you, Dr. Sandra Tarte and Professor Chris, for your comments. I wish you all a lovely afternoon and a lovely weekend, and I hope to see you around sometime. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.